Hello and welcome to this week's Scottish Independence podcast. I'm Fiona McGregor, and with my Indie Live podcast team colleague Marlene Halliday, we're going to be looking at the economic case for an independent Scotland. The Scottish Government has just published the third in their series of papers, Building a New Scotland.
We've been talking to Ian Stewart and Tim Rideout of the Scottish Currency Group, asking them for their opinion. Ian Stewart is retired now, but he was a senior banker in RBS, so he brings a lot of very hands-on experience to these discussions, and he's part of the Scottish Currency Group as well. Tim Rideout set up the reservebank.scot website. He's set out there all the steps that would be needed to set up a Scottish currency. He's also part of the Scottish Currency Group.
You're also going to hear the First Minister's voice on this. She wasn't part of our interview. We have used clips from the press conference that launched the paper. And the first of our two guests to speak is Ian Stewart.
Here we go. I'm here with Ian Stewart and Dr Tim Rideout, and it was only a few days ago that we heard the First Minister give a press conference with the latest of the Building a New Scotland papers. So we've now got to the third one, which is called A Stronger Economy with Independence.
This is not a choice, as it was often framed as in 2014, between certainty on the one hand and uncertainty on the other hand. The future is inherently uncertain. The question for Scotland is, how do we best navigate that uncertainty? And I think that's with governments that we vote for, rather than governments that we don't vote for, pursuing an economic policy based on the values of the majority in our country and harnessing the power of our abundant resources.
In 2014, it was the fears about the economy was one of the main things that stopped people voting yes, and very likely that those fears are going to be played on again by the Unionist campaign.
Why now, in these tough times? Is a stronger, fairer economy really possible with independence? What currency will we use? How will we deal with any debt and deficit we inherit? How can we protect trade across the UK if we are back in the EU?
We've got this report, and Ian's just been telling me that he spent part of the morning reading it. I don't know if you managed to get to the end, Ian, and it's long. It's long. What are the positives to take from the report? Where has it moved on from previous statements?
I think it's an excellent paper overall, with some really innovative proposals that would transform Scotland for the benefit of all living here, in my opinion. I mean, there are initiatives like the green hydrogen production, which they estimate could produce up to 300,000 new jobs in Scotland using our low-cost renewable energy. The carbon capture proposals, which would benefit the whole of Europe, not just Scotland. The green electricity that they see us using for the benefit of ourselves as consumers living in Scotland. As we all know, a large percentage of our electricity bills is down to the cost of production from gas, which is really England relies on that. Scotland doesn't. We produce our electricity from green renewables. There's also other aspects beyond the sort of currency issues that we're here to discuss, because when you read through the whole paper, which Marlene, I did finish actually, covers things like labour laws in an independent Scotland, and even change of corporate governance, which is quite an important factor because the UK has failed to change corporate governance over decades. And all that leads on to what Nicola proposes as a fairer and more socially just society.
As in any democracy, different governments will make different choices. But in this paper, we set out some of the opportunities that the economic powers of independence will open for us. For example, with powers to reform the energy market, we could ensure that our renewable resources deliver security of supply and lower costs while also tackling the climate emergency. We could ensure fairer work, European-style labour market policies in place of Westminster anti-trade union laws can bring government, business and trade unions together in a social partnership underpinned by greater worker involvement and stronger collective bargaining. This is the kind of approach increasingly championed by organisations like the OECD as the best route to high-wage, productive economies that are sustainable and more inclusive. With employment law powers, we could do more to tackle the gender pay gap and age discrimination, ensuring, for example, that young people receive the same minimum wage rate as everyone else. It is an approach based on human well-being, lifting people up so that they can contribute fully, not waiting for wealth to trickle down while the inequality gap grows. With independence, we can rejoin the EU and be back inside the world's biggest trading bloc. As an EU member state in our own right, we would for the first time be in a position not just to benefit from EU trade deals, but help shape them. We would have an immigration policy tailored to our needs, and we would have the stability of knowing that the governments making the decisions that shape our economy have actually been elected by us. These are just some of the opportunities independence would open up.
So overall, I think it's a very good paper and a great contribution to the debate. And I welcome it.
The Scottish Government will be responsible for paying the pensions of those with state pensions in an independent Scotland, either those who have that when we become independent and for those who become entitled to a pension later on.
I think another point in the pension front is it is mentioned in the document, but only as Nicola presented it very, very briefly. And I think that was a missed opportunity because I think there could have and should have been in the paper some commitment to improve the state pension in an independent Scotland, because as we all know, we've got the poorest state pension in the United Kingdom, second only to Romania across Europe. So I think that that was an opportunity. When we're talking about building a stronger economy and a fairer society, then pensioners should have been included and in that presentation and actually articulated what it could mean to pensioners. They are a very significant part of the voting population in Scotland, and we really do need to get them on side and actually make it clear to them that it is to their advantage to vote for independence.
The one thing that GERS can be used for, and it can't be challenged by the unionists since it's their figures. We collect at the moment, in 2021, there was 11.5 billion of national insurance paid in Scotland. The state pension cost 8.5 billion, and there was another 2.5 billion that went for statutory sick pay, maternity, paternity pay, and redundancy pay. That leaves £500 million left over already, which could go on an immediate pension increase.
I remember listening to you say that in a talk, and I also think that there was a bit of a stooshy arose on Twitter and social media about those facts. Although they're straight out of GERS. I went and had a look myself, and it's exactly those figures. But you did get a bit of a pile on after you said that.
They were trying to say that the health service is funded out of national insurance, and it isn't.
Yeah.
We confirm that the policy of the Scottish Government is to establish a Scottish pound. We would seek to do this as soon as practicable. The precise timing would be determined not by a fixed timetable, but by a set of objective requirements and criteria, guided by advice from the Central Bank and subject to a decision by Parliament in the overall interests of the country. This paper sets out in detail a careful and responsible phased approach, as well as the arrangements necessary to support a new currency and, in the shorter term, our continued use of sterling.
From the Scottish Currency Group's sort of perspective, the currency proposals in this report are what let it down. We spent a long time in the spring coming up with our Road to the Scottish Currency report, written, or the final drafting done by John Randall, the retired Registrar General for Scotland, who's used to dealing with ministers and how to phrase things properly, and sending that privately so that be no publicity or anything to ministers and senior civil servants, in the hope that that would influence this paper and result in something that was a sensible policy. Unfortunately, a little bit of the vocabulary seems to have been used, but it's basically been added to a camouflage net that's been flung over a reheated version of the Growth Commission. And that wasn't acceptable in 2018, and it's still not acceptable now. We put a lot of effort into coming up with a wording that would work in the prospectus, And what we basically were saying was that what you should do to accommodate the entire yes movement, come up with a common position that would work for absolutely everyone, was to say that the important thing is to get the preparations for the central bank and currency completed, but ideally by Independence Day. And that means things like a payment network for the Scottish pound, getting the banknotes and coins printed and manufactured, setting up the central bank, having the basic staff in place and an office and things like that, the IT system and so forth, in order to ensure that the post-independence government, which is probably going to be a different government, maybe it's still SNP, but we're talking about 5 years in the future, so there'll have been another election between now and then. In order to ensure that that government has the choice to introduce the new currency as soon as practicable. Obviously, I was the author of As Soon as Practicable back at the April 2019 SNP conference, and I use that deliberately so that it's not specific. It's not day 1, it's not day 27, it's not week 7 or something that is going to be subject to attack. But in our view, it does mean fairly short period, like a few weeks or perhaps a month or two after independence. But anyway, as soon as practicable, and that you would then say that it's for the government of the day, the government in 5 years' time that's actually doing this, to decide on the exact timing and mechanism for when the currency would be released. So that way you can have, the situation where you get, BBC, First Minister, what's your currency plan? Well, we're going to do the same as every other country that's become independent. We're going to have our own currency. BBC, what's the timing? First Minister, well, I can't possibly say what the timings are 5 years in advance. That would be silly. It's up to the government of the day, which can see the circumstances and take the advice of the central bank and listen to the views of Parliament and the MPs and the public to decide exactly how this is done. End of discussion.
So the First Minister, when she was in that press conference, she did use that phrase, didn't she, as soon as practicable?
We would seek to do this as soon as practicable.
Yeah,
so what's the difference between what you're meaning by it, how she's using it?
The trouble is that the report also says, it's got things like, there's a paragraph near the front of the currency section where it says, in the early years of independence, we will carry on using sterling. And it is years plural, and it is early years of independence. So this means after Independence Day. So we've probably had a 2 to 3 year transition period already between a vote and Independence Day. So we're talking about going to carry on using sterling maybe 2 or 3 years after we had the referendum, and for years plural after that. So that's not as soon as practicable.
There are people in my own side of this debate who would love me to stand up and say, on day 1 of independence, we will suddenly have our own currency. That is not possible. We need to make a transition from where we are to having our own currency, and that is what we set out. Now, during that period, when we continue to use sterling, which we are free to do because it's an internationally traded currency, it doesn't depend on agreement with the UK, we would be in a position of our monetary policy still being governed by the Bank of England. Now, that, for a transitionary period, is necessary. But we do not consider that that is a sensible position longer term, which is why we are steering the policy of moving to a separate currency as soon as practicable.
I mean, is it possible for us to move to our own Scots pound before Independence Day?
You can't do it before Independence Day because we're still part of the UK. So you'd have to do it shortly after. So, in our planet, I think it's about 2 months after Independence Day.
I listened to you going through that whole timeline, and compared to what you can pick up in other parts of the mainstream media, it's just amazing hearing that. But it's also not that unusual, isn't it, for a country? It doesn't need to take that long to set up their own currency.
I had an estimate from a consortium of central bankers that completing the preparation, the work on the IT and the systems and all the rest of it, getting the staff in place and so on for the central bank, would take between 3 and 4 years.
To add to those institutions already in place, we would create an independent Scottish Central Bank, a debt management office, and significantly strengthen the Scottish Fiscal Commission so that it effectively replicates the Office for Budget Responsibility. These institutions would operate independently of government and help ensure financial stability, transparent economic forecasting and performance monitoring, and a responsible, purposeful and efficient use of borrowing powers.
We could actually do a first year of work now, because the first year is just drawing up tender documents and sort of specifications and things like that. And you only need 3 or 4 experts to work on it. And then you could do another 2 years during the transition period. And that means that the central bank could, in fact, be up and running and ready to introduce the currency in the first months of independence.
We would start to establish the central bank after a vote for independence, so effectively in the transition period, so that it was operational on day one of independence.
From your point of view, it's a very protracted timeline. From how you think about it, I know you've talked to all sorts of people and got the evidence to back this up. It could be much shorter. I mean, why do you think the Scotgov are going for this protracted timeline? I mean, is there anything that...
It's even a bit worse than that, because we're putting obstacles in the way of the future government, because the report also talks about criteria and guides, which I think is just a sort of synonym for tests. When we're back to the 6 tests from the Earth Commission, so how under what circumstances does this government now think it's in a position to start telling a government in 5 years' time what it can and can't do in terms of introducing the currency? That's silly. You can't constrain the future government. It's up to them to decide. Listen to the governor of the Scottish Reserve Bank, see what the markets are doing, the international situation. They have to decide on what they can and can't do. That it's up to them to decide exactly how you do it, when you do it. And if that ended up taking 2 years, well, that's their decision. It's not our decision. I don't think it will.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Tim said about putting in place the preparations to issue a currency. I mean, in the Scottish Currency Group, we have agreed that you have to set up a Scottish Treasury, Central Bank, Financial Services Authority. We have to print banknotes and coins or have the designs ready. And importantly, we actually have to engage with the payment systems, both international, and set up our own domestic payment system, because 95% of domestic payments are electronic. And these things cannot be set up overnight. That requires a lot of project management and a lot of technical people involved in that. So it is a responsibility of this government, if we get a yes vote, to put in place the actual building blocks to allow a future government to actually launch a currency at a time of their choosing. And I think Tim makes a very valid point, and it's certainly one that I picked up on. In fact, it's referred to in the actual in the report itself, that these are the proposals of the current Scottish Government. The reference to current implying that they recognise that it will not necessarily be their government that will make this decision. And the likelihood is that once we get independence, of course, because we'll be using a proportional representation, then the government will probably not be a Scottish National Party government, certainly not on its own. It's more likely to be a coalition government with Greens, the LAPA, reinvigorated Scottish Labour Party.
The deficit and debt an independent Scotland will start out with will be derived from and influenced by the overall UK position. In the case of debt, it will also be determined by negotiations that follow a vote for independence. As was established in 2014, Scotland would not have legal responsibility for UK debt. We do, however, in my view, bear a moral responsibility.
Certainly, I was very concerned to see that the paper actually puts an obligation on an independent Scotland to accept part of the UK debt. I see that as very totally unnecessary, and even if we ended up in that place, you should not start negotiations by accepting that you're going to take on that liability. It's a very weak position to take. Well, we have no obligation under, as I understand it, international law to accept any part of the UK debt. We're an independent country. We didn't incur any of that debt in our own right.
If you start off accepting it, does that not mean that though that you also, it follows on from that you also get your share of the assets?
If you look at the Treasury paper published in 2013, because the UK already at that time of the previous referendum issued a statement about what they saw happening. And in international law, there's there's two models. There's what's called the continuing state model, and then there's the state disintegrates, and you have completely new states for everything. So when the Soviet Union disintegrated, the Russian Federation was the continuing state, and then everybody else was a new state. So Russia took the UN seat, and it took the debts of the Soviet Union, and it took all the assets like military bases abroad, embassies, and things like that. And then everyone else got what was in their country. So that's the normal continuing state model. When the UK Treasury issued its statement, they said they were going to take the continuing state model by which they kept all the assets, the UN seat, embassies, military bases, the Falklands, and all of that sort of stuff. But they would then apply the dissolution model to the liabilities, so that Scotland would have to take a share of the liabilities, but not the assets, which obviously that's having your cake and eat it model.
How would you approach negotiations, and what would you say to them?
What I would say is we go with the continuing state model, which is what they want. We don't need the basement of the British Embassy in Washington and get our own embassy. The one exception that we will make is we will take off their hands the enormous liability of the UK state pension system. And so we, as of Independence Day, for everyone who is domiciled in Scotland on Independence Day, the Scottish Government will take over the state pension lock, stock and barrel, possibly civil service, military pensions and things like that as well, just for simplicity. And in return for that, they get to keep the national debt.
In light of that, and indeed our desire for strong future partnership between Scottish and UK governments, we would seek a fair settlement on both debt and assets. Now, given the turmoil engulfing the UK's finances at this time, it is not possible to make an estimate of our starting fiscal position, though the IFS has suggested that in 2022-23, Scotland's deficit is likely to be similar to or lower than the UK's.
GERS is complete rubbish in terms of what the finances of an independent Scotland are going to be, but I expect that we would probably end up with a deficit in the first year or two of maybe between 8 and 10% of GDP.
We reject austerity as both morally wrong and economically counterproductive. Further, we do not accept that austerity is necessary in a country as wealthy as Scotland and with our abundance of resources. It is ultimately the creation of a sustainable, inclusive economy that delivers fiscal sustainability. Neither austerity nor tax cuts for the wealthiest will deliver that. It will come instead from investment in people and infrastructure. And GERS, which I know everybody's very fond of the GERS publication, bears this out. Even if you exclude oil revenues from Scotland's balance sheet, the revenue that we currently raise in Scotland is already sufficient to cover all day-to-day devolved expenditure, all social security expenditure, including the state pension.
Scotland can already pay for all day-to-day devolved expenditure from current resources. She was using figures from, I think the evidence for that comes from the GERS figures. So I suppose if you can prove it with GERS figures, which tends to underestimate our economy, then that's a pretty good place to start off with. So do you think she's right in what she said about that?
The tricky bit there is in devolved responsibilities, because if we're independent, we don't have just devolved responsibilities. We're going to have to pay for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Defence, and all of those things which we currently don't do. The Holyrood Parliament has a balanced budget, so its income equals its expenditure for what it does. But as I say, we've got to add on the things that we don't do, and we've got a lot of setting up to do. I mean, I've done some estimates, so we probably need about 35,000 new civil service jobs, which that's nice, well-paid jobs, which can be properly divided up around the country, so that. I got a resolution through the SNP conference last year that those new jobs should be allocated in proportion to the population of each 32 council areas. so that you'd get sort of 1,000 jobs going to the Western Isles, for example, and 2,500 going to Dumfries and Galloway, and not all just been in Edinburgh. So that, you know, that's a benefit to the country. It's not just a cost, because that's somebody's salary and they're going to pay tax and spend it in the shops and all the rest of it. But it's still money that we're going to have to spend. We're going to need office buildings, infrastructure, IT systems, furniture.
That is why we propose in this paper the Building a New Scotland Fund. Oil and gas is a declining asset, and our obligation to the planet means that we must move away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible. But oil and gas can't be switched off overnight, so Scotland could benefit from these revenues for some time yet. If we invest remaining oil revenues and use our new borrowing powers responsibly and for a purpose, we can invest up to £20 billion in the first decade of independence. This investment will help accelerate the transition to net zero and transform communities, and crucially, it will help kickstart the inclusive growth that will help get our newly independent nation on a fiscally sustainable path while building the fair society we all want.
On page 64 of the report, which is contradictory to some of our more negative views about it being a protracted period. It's not totally clear that that would be the case, because in their own paper they say it is of paramount importance that they join the European Union as quickly as possible.
Take Europe, for example, there will be a paper, as I said, I think a moment ago, dedicated to issues around European membership. Yes, there will be a process of negotiation that is required there, but nobody with any credibility seriously suggests that Scotland would not be welcomed back into the European Union. And while there would be a process of negotiation, most people who know what they're talking about on this issue are very clear that that would not be a particularly lengthy process. But these are issues that we will continue to update and inform people on.
And throughout the whole report, they consistently and recurrently refer to being in the European Union. They don't mention EFTA or European Economic Area, it's the European Union. And of course, they would require to be a currency issuer to even be considered. So there is a bit of ambiguity in terms of ascertaining just exactly what timescales referred to here.
About just picking you up on having to have a currency before we'd even be considered. We could engage with the EU. We could start on their formal, they've got a whole set of chapters that you formally work through to move towards being accepted into the EU. That can all go ahead even without a country having its own currency. So, there could be a kind of dual process, so it wouldn't happen until after independence.
But there is nothing that would stop an independent Scotland or any country applying to join or rejoin, in our case, the EU, before we have our own currency. Clearly, the negotiation around rejoining and the process of establishing our own currency would be processes that we would want to align. But the idea that we would have to have our own currency before we start that process of re-entry to the EU is not the case.
So there could be a group of people working with the EU to work through and come up with a proposal to join the EU, which presumably then there has to be a referendum about. Commentators like Kirsty Hughes reckon that could be done in 4 to 5 years, which apparently is quite quick. But it doesn't mean you have to have your own currency in those 4 to 5 years, but you definitely would have to have your currency before you'd get accession. Yeah. So there could be a kind of parallel set of negotiations going on or work going on, couldn't there?
I mean, I would hope the discussions are taking place right now in terms of an independent Scotland joining the EU. I'd be very disappointed if that wasn't the case. But whatever discussions take place now or at some time in the not too distant future, we still would have to be a currency issuer in our own right.
We want these processes to be as short as possible for obvious reasons, and have confidence that they can be short periods of time. And I would repeat a point I've already made. There is no other route back into the EU other than Scotland being independent. So yes, there will be a process that we have to go through to achieve that, but that is compared to the alternative of a permanent existence outside the EU, which is what we will have if we remain part of the UK.
What do you think about it as a strategy? This one paper at a time, revealed, a little bit revealed, another bit revealed.
I think it's a necessary part of the process. I think the paper itself, as I say, overall it reads very well. I was interested listening to Call K on Radio Scotland today, that she was asking for comments from the listeners as to whether Nicola had convinced them about independence from the paper that was issued yesterday. Now, at that time this morning, I was halfway through reading the 110-page document. My wife did actually text into Call K, and it was read out. How many of your callers have actually read 3 pages, never mind the 110 pages of this paper? So, people are passing comments on something that they haven't actually read, not even in summary, never mind in detail. So I think, it's a 110-page document. It's a good paper. It's a great addition to the debate. But you've got to ask yourself how many people, apart from political nerds and the press, are going to read it in total. And I think that's a big challenge for any political party, and particularly for the SNP as we move to independence. I did a check with my 2 daughters regarding what they thought they could get out of a 110-page document. And needless to say, neither of them said they would even consider reading a 110-page document. And when I mentioned about availability of information on Facebook or in the newspapers, they both said that nobody under 40 reads newspapers nor actually uses Facebook. Their assessment was, for Nicola and the SNP and the Yes Movement to get messages out there, we need to be much sharper, much more punchy. That's something we'll have to think about as we move into the referendum, how to subdivide this and put it into punchy straplines that are going to have an impact on a generation that, by and large, is very pro-independence anyway.
It's the folk, over 65s that are still unconvinced. So maybe since we're the ones that are on Facebook, I didn't realise it was just more or less my age group. I did a little survey yesterday, so after the press conference. So I'm in a WhatsApp group. It's a Yes group. I was saying, I think there was a few open goals left there, and could have said this, could have said that. Yeah. And so one person came on and said, well, she finds those press conferences really useful because she sort of says, she says, look, I know I understand, I want Scotland to be independent, but I'm not too much up into all the things it might have to do. So if she listens to a press conference like that, her own experience was she just learned something else by listening to it and thinks, I didn't know that. And I went, well, okay, that's a good, that's a good outcome. And someone else in the WhatsApp groups came in and said she thought it was quite a good idea to leave open goals. She's okay, maybe they didn't do it deliberately, but because by the end of a press conference, what lines the unionists, the usual suspects in those press conferences, you kind of you hear what they're coming up with, and it tells you where they're going to go with it in a campaign. And I thought, okay, I suppose that's fair enough. Though I also think we know where they're going to go with it in the campaign because they've been coming out with this stuff for the last 8 years. What do you think about this whole strategy of, a set of papers coming out one after the other? Do you think that's going to do what we need to get us to a yes vote?
I'm not convinced. I'm probably one of the few people that read the white paper in 2014, which is about 600 pages or something. Then there was a general view amongst people that that was ridiculously too long, and we didn't want to do that. So we've decided to do 10 papers of 110 pages each, which means we're going to come up with something that's twice the length of 2014. So, as Ian said, I think nobody's going to read them. After something like 50 talks around the country, I think there's really just 4 or 5 questions that people want the answers to, and you can do it. I think there's going to be no movement in the opinion polls until we just decisively answer those questions. The questions are, what currency are we going to use? The answer is we're going to have our own pound as soon as practicable after Independence Day. What's going to happen to the border between England and Scotland? Well, it's going to be exactly the same as the border between Northern Ireland and England. So whatever that ends up as, then it's going to be the same for Scotland. So there will be some sort of checks. You won't have to show your passport, and that's the way it's going to work. What's going to happen about pensions? Well, we're going to take over the state pension, lock, stock, and barrel. Things like the Scottish Health Service, Police, Fire Service, whatever. They're already Scottish pensions run by the Scottish government. Same with the councils. So then that just leaves the private pensions and the UK Central Civil Service and Army to resolve. What's going to happen about Europe? Well, we can rejoin the EEA and EFTA as of Independence Day, which gets us back in the single market, solves the problem of access to the EU market, gets some ferries up and running that go direct so we don't have to go through England. And we will then negotiate with the EU. We'll see what happens at the end of those negotiations when you have to put it to a referendum, which is required by the EU. And we may or may not decide to join the EU. We might decide we quite like the Norway position and we're going to stay in the Norway position. That's really all you have to answer. You don't need 1,000 pages to answer that.
We certainly do need to keep it simple. But of course, for the political commentators and the press, etc., you do need to have a fairly detailed background plan as well. So, I don't see one as being exclusive to the other. I think you do need to have the detailed planning there. I mean, Brexit was a classic case of no detailed planning, and see where we've got with Brexit. So I'm reassured that intelligent people are putting together a detailed plan behind the scenes here. But Tim's absolutely right. For the general population to get the vote, let's keep it simple. And if we can keep it to 6 key points, then so much the better.
Thanks so much for both of you coming on and being prepared to chat to us here. Thanks again for coming on.
Thank you.
Thank you for...
That was a fascinating discussion, wasn't it? You got Ian and Tim directed right into the heart of some of the main questions in this whole debate. I mean, the two that stuck out for me in particular was whether we still have these 6 tests or not, because Ian Blackford in the Opposition Day debate just last week referred to 6 tests. The First Minister was a bit vague that there would be tests and criteria, and Tim and Ian are adamant that there shouldn't be.
Certainly not as defined criteria to be met. It did seem during the launch that still part of the thinking, but less of a criteria, more of a guideline, a bit more room round about them in terms of when they might, how much weight's giving to them. I certainly got that impression, but goodness, I mean, I'm no economist, so.
No, it certainly seems logical that you should have some criteria against which to decide if you're ready to go to the next stage of your plan or not. Tim first came to notice, really, didn't he, when he was at one of the SNP conferences, and he took the 6 tests apart. He just blew them out the water.
Test 1, deficit and debt. Well, as has already been said this afternoon, we don't have any debts, as that's not allowed at the moment. And if we borrowed 12 billion a year for 15 years, we would just reach the average debt level of an EU member country. So where's the problem that this test addresses? Test 2, a credible central bank. The job of a central bank is to issue and manage a currency. If there is no currency, it's not a central bank, and it can't be credible. So this is a catch-22 test. Test 3, does it meet the needs of the people and business? The only difference is the picture on the banknote and a new name. Your wage is the same, the prices in the shops are the same, it's all voluntary anyway. So why would it not meet our needs? Reserves, test 4. Seriously? The test is also irrelevant, as the new currency will not be handed out for free. Every new note issued has to be bought with sterling handed in to the equivalent amount. The currency actually starts automatically with 100% reserves. That could be 50 billion. That's 5 times what Finland has, and it's actually more than the 55 billion US dollars that the Bank of England has. Test 5, does it fit our trade patterns? 50% of food and drink goes to the EU, 6% of whiskey goes to the UK. If you know what this test is about, send me an email. Test 6, have we decoupled from the UK business cycle? We certainly should ditch UK mismanagement, but we never will do that by using sterling and having our policies decided for us in London. The only way to decouple is to have your own currency. So to conclude, and slightly misquoting Macbeth, If 'twere done, then 'twere best done quickly.
He's probably responsible for them disappearing from the discussion. Have they really disappeared? You know, that the paper doesn't make it very clear, I think.
If you don't refer to any sort of guiding principles about when the shift over to the currency might happen, then the unionist press pile in on you. If you come up with something that's far too rigid, they also pile in on you. So, I can see that it's a hard thing to judge how to put it when you're launching it. And, it would certainly be a mistake in the terms of First Minister or the Scottish Government to tie themselves into something that's too specific, no matter how much they're pressed. I mean, you could see, that in that launch, there were certain sections of the press who were there who were pushing to get something more definitive said, and she was not doing it.
The other main discrepancy, and it's probably as a result of that lack of clarity about what happens when, is the timescale. How long does this take? And you've been doing some research, haven't you? And we've got a lovely little summary of what we think is the most likely timescale.
I enjoyed putting it together.
Now, this being a podcast, we're not able to show you the clip that Marlene put together, but it is on our Indie Live Extra YouTube channel, and I'll put the link in the notes to this podcast.
There's lots of unknowns in that, but I just thought it was really helpful to just put the two things on the same bit of paper, as it were, just to explain that those two, at least joining EU and setting up a country, are pretty well going to be in sync as long as we get on with it. And there's a complication about maybe join EFTA. Well, it's easier in terms of it doesn't take as long and you don't need your own currency to join as an EFTA member. Probably they would quite like to have us. That's what we all think anyway. But I'm sure that's probably true. And that would be one of the pathways, the options that Kirsty talked about in that interview last month.
Yeah. That was something we specifically looked at when we were talking to Kirsty. So if anybody wants to go back and look at that, you can get it on our YouTube channel, Indie Live Extra. I wasn't expecting them to dovetail just quite as well as they did. That was quite impressive, the way they came together like that. And of course, the other unknown quantity is just what other things are we going to have to do in that period, because there's a lot more than just currency and EFTA to worry about, much more.
The thing that struck me about EFTA against the EU, because I've in the past, I want us eventually to go back into the EU, but then I've thought, well, EFTA would be quite a good fit. And there's a lot of discussion, at least with, there's a lot of discussion around that. Yes, we could get in, more quickly, but if we do that, we'd be in there and we'd still be using sterling. Maybe that's okay, but that raises other questions for me. Well, is it okay? And what do you do about your borrowing? Are you borrowing in sterling or,
That's a really good question. And after we'd recorded the main interview with Tim and Ian, we were having a little backstage chat in the studio, and that exact question came up. And Tim had some very good advice for us on whether or not you should borrow ever in somebody else's currency. So let's just play that now. It's only a minute or so. Thing that caught my eye that I was hoping you would ask, and I thought it's not really relevant, but was Douglas Ross trying to imply Scotland's going to become Venezuela. Quite a leap, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think Douglas Ross has forgotten that Venezuela's had problems, but one of its big problems was that the USA take it against it because it didn't like its left-wing president, and thumping sanctions on.
Exactly.
Venezuela is a very good reason for why you need to have your own currency. I don't think they're proper economics, but I have two laws of currency. The first law of currency is that the state requires that all official payments are in the currency of the state only. As of currency day, the Scottish government would pay the wages, pay suppliers, and require tax in Scottish pounds, and will not accept sterling. You try going to HMRC and paying your tax bill in US dollars, because they won't accept it. So that's the first law of currency. The second law of currency is never borrow somebody else's. And that's one of the problems with sterlingization. If we spend years sterlingized, we're borrowing sterling, which is a foreign currency. And that's how Venezuela gets into trouble, because they go and borrow US dollars to finance imports.
Yeah. Did Sri Lanka not do that recently as well? They borrowed
foreign currencies, usually dollars, Turkey's the same thing. They've got massive dollar debts. So don't do it.
Yeah.
Important message. We'll get that in the programme.
Put that out. Don't do it. Yeah. Okay, great.
That was quite unequivocal from Tim, wasn't it? And I think that is the element of the Scottish Government's paper that I'm least comfortable with, is the open-ended period that we're going to be using sterling.
I mean, the phrase is there, isn't it? As soon as is practicable to move to our own currency. It's just what we were saying earlier. It's like, could call it vagueness, all right, but you could also say, being a bit more positive about it, you could say, well, they're keeping their options open, and there are good reasons for keeping your options open. But yes, certainly Tim was pretty unequivocal about it there. And the other thing I think that people don't really know much about that is that if you are a country who's asking to join the EU and you've been accepted as a candidate, that would be the first gate that you have to go through. At that point, the EU will then be offering you an associate trade deal. And most people don't, I think, know that. I never knew that until I was at a talk that actually was Kirsty who was giving it, and she mentioned it then, and at that point I thought, oh, that would make a lot of difference, and it does go some way to balance out the argument. One argument for going into EFTA quickly is that you then have advantage of their trade deals that they've already got in place, but actually you'd also have a trade deal with the EU if you're talking to them. So
the interview we did with Kirsty's got a lot of that discussion in it. That's where we've got to so far, looking at the specifics of the currency and the economy and the government paper, and no doubt we will return to that over the coming months.
Anyway, we should stop there.
Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll be back again on Friday. We have an episode out every Friday, plus the occasional Tuesday bonuses as well, if there's a lot going on, which there certainly has been recently. And if you don't already follow us, please do so, then you won't miss anything. You can also get us on our Indie Live Extra YouTube channel, our Indie Live Podcasters TikTok channel, our @ScottishIndiePod Twitter, and I'll put links to the various shows we've mentioned in the notes to this podcast. Catch you later. Bye now.